So hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. So we've just got a few kind of slides just to start off with in terms of kind of introductions and things. And yeah, just wanted to say firstly how happy we are to be here. We've had a few months off during the summer, but the webinar today really kind of kicks off the next few months of events for us. So yeah, you're all very welcome to join us. And on the next slide, you'll see a bit of a route map for today. So just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about us with some introductions, and then really the meat of the webinar is staying kind of very true to the title today. So firstly, we're going to be doing a bit of kind of reflection over what this year so far has been like, how we've been kind of navigating it, any kind of challenges which people might have been likely to come across. And then we're going to be moving forwards and thinking about, okay, what's 2022 likely to kind of present us with, and how can we think about making sure that we can sort of thrive in 2022 as much as possible. Next of all, we've got something which is hopefully a bit more kind of pragmatic and something which you can kind of really hopefully take away and apply in your own context, which is about putting all this stuff into practice around your strategy. And then finally, we hope to have plenty of time for some open questions as well. So please, you know, as always, make sure that you feel sort of comfortable to put things in the chat if you have sort of links and comments and things like that. And then with Q&A, it's really helpful if you put that in the kind of Q&A menu, and then we can kind of make sure that we're monitoring that and kind of addressing your questions as they come in towards the end of the webinar. So yeah, it should be quite a packed webinar today, but just a couple of slides to begin with, which will be mostly familiar to you all, I expect. This first one is really about us as an organisation, Moore Kingston Smith. We're an accountancy firm, but we really kind of pride ourselves on our specialism in the charity sector. So we've got 14 charity specialist partners, and also have all sorts of services, which on the next slide you'll see includes us lot. So this is us, we're the fundraising and management team. And we bring together three kind of sub-disciplines around impact measurement, fundraising and finance. And we kind of bring them all together, as well as being out on their own, into a kind of strategic, sort of more holistic approach as well. So that's us really. And then just as a little bit of a kind of sneak peek around what we've got coming up, we've got a bit of a packed schedule coming up sort of in the autumn time. So we've got some kind of roundtables on social investment and a few other things, but one of the things I really wanted to sort of highlight is we have a training session which accompanies this webinar, which will basically be about going into sort of much more depth and bringing in kind of new content around what we're going to cover today. It's going to include lots of interaction, lots of discussion, and kind of chances to apply the learning. So that will be a half day on the 21st of October. So definitely look out for that and have a little look into it if you enjoy today's webinar and you think that might be helpful for you and your organisation. And as always, you know, an open invitation to people to kind of get in touch with us and arrange a 30-minute chat if you'd like to. But I think that's probably enough spent on that sort of thing. So without further ado, I will pass on to Dan.
Great, thanks very much, Helen. And it's great, as Helen said, it's great to be with you this afternoon and to get our heads around thinking through some of the things that have happened over the last 18, 19 months and what does that mean for our non-profit organisations moving forwards. So I'm going to spend a bit of time thinking about navigating 2021, and I've got a diagram to do that. I spent hours creating the scales and going through the different things on clip art, and then my colleagues afterwards told me that it didn't quite present what they thought it was going to do, and they weren't sure which were the upside and which was the downside. So from my perspective, and possibly from some of you listening and watching, the left-hand side I thought was the upside, and the right-hand side, which is maybe heavier, is the downside. And so thinking through some of the ones on the left, some of the opportunities that have come from the last year, and thinking that through, a number of charities have been telling us that there have been various ways that they've responded to the pandemic, which have actually allowed them to do new things, allowed them to do different things, allowed them to grow. They found new purpose or momentum, and they've really risen to the occasion. And I think the sector press is still quite full of lots of good stories of charities that have done that and have found ways to move forward during the pandemic, responding to the range of need that's around them. One of the reasons that they've been able to do that is that that there have been lots of good examples of improved funder relationships, and funders also stepping up and helping out in a way which maybe they didn't do pre-COVID. There's been greater trust between grant makers and between charities. The grant makers giving money to charities and saying, just get on and do the good stuff that you do. The symbiosis between the grantor and the grantee has become more apparent, that without charities, grant makers can't do very much. Without grant makers, charities will be able to do a lot less, and the two need to work together very well. But with that, there's a growing understanding of the shared responsibility that they need to both work together to help those that benefit from the work that charities and non-profits do. And there's been and continue to be great examples of emergency funding, which has enabled charities to respond to the increased need, but also to deal with the fact that other sources of funding have been more tricky. And that extent of funding has actually resulted in some charities that we speak to having more cash than usual, which is not something that I'm used to saying, but it is a peculiar result of the pandemic. Charities have been able to access sometimes large amounts of funding that they haven't been used to receiving, and they've also a combination of reticence and limited opportunities has meant that they've maybe spent less over the last year and a bit than they've been used to spending as well. So overall, the balance that they have of cash in their bank accounts is actually going up. And that then holds other challenges, which we'll touch on a bit later on. Digital is also obviously a key thing. The fact that we're doing this webinar to you now is a demonstration of how digital has transformed the way we all communicate. And the shock of the pandemic has helped charities really to catch up with the existing trends that were there anyway, but maybe charities have been lagging behind a little bit. Particularly in the way that they accept income and how people give, and that has moved on in leaps and bounds in the sort of online media, and also in the sort of cashless transactions, but also in the way that people or how and where people work and where they work from. And as you can see, I think all three of us are sitting in our homes at the moment rather than in an office, but we're still talking to you and we're still doing work in much the same way as we would have done had we been in a normal office. We've also found that many clients that we speak to, that digital has helped them to save money. It's increased the access to new donors that they can reach, and it's also saved time in cutting out some repetitive tasks that they may be used to taking in non-digital ways. So all of those things are positives, and those positives sort of have been building up into the Build Back Better concept, that we don't want to return to the pre-COVID ways. Some of those ways weren't actually as good as they could have been, and COVID has given that opportunity to reflect, to take stock, and to say, well, no, we want to do things differently. And some of our clients are definitely benefiting from responding to new ways in new ways to interact with their clients. And some of that has been also in being more authentic with clients, and wanting to really listen to clients and beneficiaries as well, in terms of understanding what it is that they actually need from the charities, not just doing the same old, but making sure that what the charities do is really relevant. And then sort of with that Build Back Better, not wanting things to be the same, touched a bit on flexible working already. That has reduced the stress of commuting. It's reduced sickness rates across the country. It's also played into increasing or improving inclusivity in the workplace, and creating better ways for organizations to really working in different ways, and some of that involves working collaboratively. So we've also seen a number of organizations talking to us about how they can work in partnership with others, and can they work in partnership with others in order to create more systemic positive change. And we'll talk a bit about partnerships later on as well. But there are downsides on the other side of the scales. Demand has increased significantly for some charities. Hasn't just been the result of COVID, it's maybe some of the knock-on and some of the unrelated societal changes. Many people have been worse off in 2021 than they were in 2019. Food banks are still very necessary, even with increased grants, even some government grants going into them. Employment is also an issue. The end of furlough this month may affect some, but there are sort of two employment challenges. One is that actually there are many more jobs available than have been in the past. But perversely, whilst there are sort of high rates of vacancies, there's also difficulty that some people have in terms of finding work that they can do, maybe from being furloughed for months or from not having the right skills that are now needed because we're building back better in a different way. For some people, or maybe for all of us, actually, the COVID shift has been the most significant change in the way that people work since the Industrial Revolution. And in years to come, we'll look back on these years and some marvel at the changes that have gone on. We've also seen that stakeholders are wanting to demand more. They expect a greater level of digital competence. They expect greater attention to issues like inclusivity, diversity. They also expect organizations to pay more attention to things like climate change and some of the bigger issues that are out there, which will come and hit us after COVID is gone. And so charities are having to think a bit more about how they respond to those needs that the stakeholders are presenting. And think about when COVID's gone. It hasn't gone yet. The UK is still one of the three worst countries in the world for COVID rates, with Brazil and the US. Things aren't good here. We have the potential of a fourth wave rather, in the winter. What does that actually mean? That creates lots of uncertainty about how we work, how we move forwards, how we open up or we don't open up. And just preparing for the winter is a challenge for many charities that we speak to, because they don't really know what will quite be appropriate in terms of service delivery or even how we work. So that uncertainty just makes planning difficult, whether it's due to COVID or due to the economic uncertainty that we're all also facing. I mean, the current gas crisis is just one demonstration how something can happen very quickly and can have myriad knock-ons that we don't expect. Who knew before this last week that rising gas prices would affect the how meat gets onto the shelves in shopping in supermarkets because of carbon dioxide, for example. So lots of uncertainty. We don't know where things are going in the future. And then just on the money, fewer fundraising opportunities. Perhaps maybe because of that uncertainty, we don't know how easy it is going to be able to fundraise from people face to face moving forwards, and worries about how much people can continue to give in the face of diminishing resources for people, increased cost of living for your average donor. And with that, although I've said that charities have never been better off, that's not all charities, and there are still challenges of diminishing reserves. We've had to spend the money that's been set aside for the rainy day. It hasn't been raining, it's been pouring, but it's still raining, and some of those reserves are diminishing for some charities, and so decisions have to be made as to how to move forward and how to go into the future. And then hopefully this will work. Within that, there's also the challenge of complexity. It's a positive, and complexity creates opportunities. It's also a negative, a challenge. It just makes life a little bit difficult. We don't know how things are. We're used to dealing with things which are simple and easy to understand. So how we manage complexity moving forward is a key thing for thriving in 2021. So before I finish my little bit, just to think about moving forward into 2022, how do we prepare for that? We've showed this sort of slide before, the sigmoid growth curve. The idea being that growth doesn't keep on going, but if you do want it if you do want to be able to keep on growing, you need to change, to shift a little bit on that sigmoid curve and to start a new one. of the charities that we speak to, maybe half of them are just trying to get by, just trying to survive. But the other half are really thinking about, well, how can we do things differently? How can we reimagine who we are and how we work in order to continue to grow into the future? And they're the ones who will be trying to go up that dashed line, that second sigmoid curve there on the slide. So as we move forward into thinking about 2022 and what we need to do in order to thrive in 2022, so my challenge to you is to think about, do you know what levers to pull to make the biggest change in your organization? We often think about impact and money in our team, and money is important, but I think we tend to decide that you need to start on trying to make the most impact, and then the resources, the money will follow. So do you know in your organization what you can do in order to pull the levers to make the most impact, and to hope that the money will follow that? So that's all I wanted to do on sort of reflecting on this year, and now my colleagues will Karen and Mark will talk about the coming year.
So thanks, Dan. Now we're going to talk about thriving in 2022, and it's interesting in that most of the conversations, I'm having, and as Dan says, there's 50% that are trying to reimagine, and 50% of organizations we're talking to that are just trying to survive, but they're all worried about unrestricted funding. It's interesting in that those that are getting restricted, they're saying, okay, we're still seeing the restricted coming through, but it's the unrestricted that is an issue, if you like. So on the next slide, I've got 6 ways that you can respond to challenges, opportunities, but specifically how you can deal with unrestricted and the changing level of unrestricted. I mean, the first is increase income. Easier said than done. If you just go back one slide, if you can, Dan. Yeah. So increase income, easier said than done. But at the same time, I'm going to give you some thoughts as to how we can do the, that bit about increasing income for the future, or at least holding steady within that. People are asking, how can we reduce costs? And I think this goes hand in hand with efficiency. In other words, if you've got time, you can really take cost out of the business. If you've got time, you can outsource. If you've got time, you can do all sorts of things to become more efficient. For example, put in technology and transformation. If you don't have time, you're going to have to do things in a much more blunt way. So for example, reducing your costs, you might have to turn to that much earlier. But I do believe number 3, improving cost recovery, getting more from the grants, contracts that you put in for, from the local authorities, from CCGs, etc. If you get that right, there's 5 to 10% more, and you don't have to really spend a long time doing that. You just have to go through the process of, if you like, building a framework and identifying how you cost and price better to get more money coming in. Number 5, reimagination, I think is really exciting. I think, I'm seeing a lot of organizations, for example, thinking about building social enterprises. I'm going to come back to talk about that, and working in partnerships and doing things in a different way. I think that's really interesting, but again, it takes time. So what is your strategy? How can you respond to some of these things? We're going to talk through each of these individual, areas. It really depends on how much time you've got. And if you've got time, you can do almost all of these and really take your time thinking about it. If you don't have time and you've got to respond now, for example, to survive, cost recovery is a good place to start. How can you engage people to get more money, and how do you go through the cost reduction in quite a hard way? And we're going to talk about that on the next couple of slides. Yeah. So Dan, now you can go to the next slide. I'm sorry, it just suddenly flicked through, didn't it? Yeah, I'm so sorry about that.
I was too keen, but go for it now, Mark.
So it's really interesting. In the last 2 years, we've seen the fundraising world really shrink. We've seen those things like events that weren't working before. Some of them have gone online with marathons, but many of them have just had to stop. Yeah. We've seen organizations finding new ways to do things, but also, now the opportunity is that you're going to be able to do things with the old world and the new world. So you've got a smorgasbord, if you like, of ways that you can raise fundraising money. But here's the thing for me. Yeah. If you're going to go, for example, and focus on legacies, the average time for a legacy to come in is 8 years. Okay. So you've got to be thinking about the investment now to drive the change that you're looking for in the future. And you know, let's say, for example, you're going to get regular givers or regular donors. That takes time, you know, to recruit and then to manage that so that they pay back over time. So getting your investment cases ready now, strategically understanding how you're going to interact with those stakeholder groups to give you the most money, it's really important. And a lot of the organizations we're working with are saying, right, we're going to go on the trusts and foundations route for the first time. We're going to get money in a way that we haven't got, for example, from corporates in the past. Well, that's going to put more pressure on corporates. Yeah, and they're going to be able to say no more readily to you because there's more competition for the funding. So it's worthwhile asking, how do you get the specialist skills in place to do that and to maximize your chance? Of course, we're happy to help with that. Dan's a fundraising specialist. But on the flip side, just asking yourself that question, how can we maximize our opportunity here, is really important. From my side of things, building social enterprises, I'm finding it quite exciting that actually there are organizations that are starting to want to sell things or price things differently rather than actually give their services away. A simple example, I was talking to somebody the other day who does hearing aids, and they're saying we can no longer give hearing aids away. We're going to have to start to charge something for it. That will make them more sustainable. That's an exciting change. But here's the thing. Do they have the DNA to be able to start to sell, yeah, rather than give you know, money away or things away? And you can't just take your fundraising teams and suddenly rebadge them as social enterprise you know, salespeople. It just doesn't work if they don't have that DNA and they don't have those skills. So really thinking through some of the options you've got, I think is exciting. I think social enterprise, especially at the moment, is a really good option. Onto the next slide then. And I don't think there's no prizes really for guessing what this is. Yeah, it's a salami slicer. You know, and what you always hear is that as you start to look at your budgets, don't try and salami slice. Don't take a cut and then a cut and then a cut. Cut once, cut deeply if you're going to have to need to cut in the future. But I think there's other things you can do. So back to Carl in the chat here. You know, Carl's saying we're asset rich and cash poor, considering refinancing our mortgage. I think social investment is going to be really interesting in that social investment, some organizations are going to want, you know, some lenders are going to want a market rate of return. As you refinance, maybe those aren't going to be, you know, any different from the rates you're already on. But there are other social investors who are wanting to give almost repayable grant terms to help organizations. That could save you huge amounts, especially if you've taken a government loan on the CPF scheme, which means that actually they will, you can replace that money with something probably on a better basis, on you know, better funding terms. So I think, you know, the final thing to say about reducing costs, there's so many more ideas that I can give to you, yeah. But it's about getting to the core of your business. If you're going to have to cut, what is the core of your business? And if you think about it, overheads are 10% of your business. What about the income you bring in? What about the other 90% of expenditure? That is where you can cut just as well as overheads. And yet I hear all the time trustees saying, we need to cut, let's cut our overheads. It's not so helpful sometimes, because without the scaffolding, you can't run the organization. On to the next slide then, Dan. The third thing, which I really urge, you know, all charities to get this right. Still about a third of all charities we work with can't articulate their costs, can't see the surplus or deficit per income stream or activity stream, miss out on 5 to 10% of the income they could generate because they're picking and choosing and cherry picking the costs they put into bids. And then the final bit of the equation is have negotiated bad rates in the past. And so in the future, local authorities, for example, will just give them the same rates again. There's no incentive to change. So getting on top of your costing, getting on top of your pricing, I believe is a quick and easy way that you can start to, you know, address maybe pressure on unrestricted. it takes a bit of energy, it takes a bit of effort, it takes good management information, but you won't be sorry for that journey that you go on. Yeah. And again, you know, it's something that we've done an incredible amount of work over the last 2 years, Marcus and myself from the team, on cost recovery, helping different clients to maximize that. On to the next slide then. I think it's just one comment from me and then I'm handing on to Helen. Yeah. And so, you know, we're back to efficiency. I mean, you know, you might think about outsourcing. You might think about putting a better computer system in place, which will help you to articulate the numbers better. And I don't know, so people can find their budgets themselves rather than you having to send it out. That will require an investment for the future. Getting and thinking in an investment mindset for 2022 will be incredibly important. Yeah. So Helen, rather than talking about the money side of things, why don't you talk about the impact side of things?
Great, thank you, Mark. Yeah, that was a great segue. So from an impact perspective, really what we want to think about is how can you carry on creating the same amount of impact with less, or possibly even more impact with the same amount. And this is where the efficiency question really comes in. And there may be a sort of a whole range of things to look at here. And one of the reasons why impact measurement is so powerful is that the whole process of it will present you with opportunities to think in this way about efficiency of impact, and really to interrogate the kind of outcomes that you're creating and how you might be able to increase the value of those outcomes in certain ways. But just instead of going into huge amounts of depth about those things, I wanted to just sort of touch on really a collection of a few different questions that you might want to kind of reflect on when it comes to your organization's impact. So the first one is around negative outcomes, and this is something that we talk about all the time when it comes to impact measurement. We're not just interested in the good news stories, we're also interested in having honest, transparent conversations with stakeholders about what's not working for them at the moment. And you know, every organization, every individual, we all move around the world, creating social value in some areas and destroying social value in others. And this whole process is about being accountable and being honest with your stakeholders and giving them the voice to really be able to tell you about any negative outcomes that they're experiencing. So that's the first area. And one of the things that we encounter with organizations is that they often have these sort of regular the kind of friendly type stakeholders that appear a lot in case studies, that appear a lot in kind of funding applications and things like that. But you also want to reach out to stakeholders who might have stopped attending sessions halfway through, or they might have dropped off and you'd never really heard from them again. So this whole conversation about negative outcomes is about trying to broach these things with people who may not be the regular people that you speak with your organization on a regular basis. The other element is, of course, if you're coming to them and trying to talk to them about negative outcomes, there may be some opportunity to try and establish some ground rules for that conversation. So making it really clear that your support isn't dependent on them having a positive experience. They might then feel more empowered to have a conversation with you about that. Or it may be worth bringing someone sort of independent coming in as well to kind of try and identify those negative outcomes and make sure that your stakeholders are able to be as open as they possibly can. So that's the first thing. The second thing is reflecting on what are the most important outcomes that you're creating for people's lives. So our approach to impact measurement follows this sort of global 7 principles of social value, and principle number 3 is around valuing what matters. And this is about trying to understand which are the most important outcomes. And this question is really, really useful when you come to service redesign, because if you have that kind of information handy, if you understand from your stakeholders' perspective what the most important outcomes are, when you're thinking about how to redesign those services, that becomes a really important element. So for example, if you're running a number of sessions and you know that the most important outcome for people is that they're meeting people in a similar situation and they're connecting with their peer group and things, next time when you come to service redesign, you can make sure that there's more time available for people to connect with each other. You can make sure that you're really maximizing the opportunity for that outcome to happen and the importance of that outcome for people. And this is what I mean when I say that impact measurement is the whole process is a really good opportunity and presents these kind of ideas to you as you sort of flow through this kind of step of impact measurement process that we've talked about in many of these webinars over the past few months. So we've got negative outcomes, we've got important outcomes. The next one is really about, are you collecting the right data? So some organizations collect lots of information about their users, about their stakeholders. But what we have found when we are working with organizations in the past is that they're often not collecting the kind of information which makes sure that they can maximize their social value. So just as an example, we worked with an organization who sort of very early on in the pandemic wanted to really improve and maximize the social value of their befriending service. So they moved it all to a sort of phone service, as many organizations did. And we went and sort of helped them to measure the social impact of this. In the course of these conversations, and we did a lot of stakeholder engagement, and we found that the people who experienced the most impact were the people who lived by themselves and who were socially isolated in some respects. But the organization itself didn't have any information about which people who lived by themselves, who lived with lots of family members, who had very good sort of solid relationships with neighbors and things like that. So they weren't as able to target their activity specifically at stakeholders who would be more likely to experience more outcomes. So it's probably worth asking yourself and reflecting on the kind of data that you're collecting. So number one, are you collecting the kind of data that means that you can target your services in an effective way? Because if you're not, that's a really useful sort of open door that you can push towards efficiency. And number two, on the subject of efficiency, are you collecting any data that you just don't use? So are you sending out lots of forms? Are you getting lots of people to spend time filling it in, putting it into spreadsheets, and then it just sits there and it doesn't use? So take that opportunity to really reflect on those things that you're collecting and really trying to make sure that it's all focused on this kind of ultimate target, which is creating the most amount of impact for the people who matter for your organization, for your stakeholders. So if we go on to the next slide, you'll see it's a kind of possibly a sort of more zoomed out subject, which is about reimagining. So we're not thinking so much about service redesign, we're thinking about taking a step back from that and thinking, actually, what's changed about the environment we're operating in, what's changed about the needs of our stakeholders, are there other ways that we can fulfill these needs, are you being as effective as you can? So this slide is really about having a think and kind of zooming out. I know that the team at MKS, we're having many conversations with organizations who are at the beginning of a sort of strategy process for the next sort of 5 years or so. It just so happens that many organizations are kind of entering into the next round of strategy creation and things like that. And we would really encourage and invite you to be as imaginative and open-minded as you can about really thinking about what your stakeholders need, why you exist, and really trying to take a step back and sort of reflect on this. So one example is a funder that we work with a lot who is involved in giving grants to people to make sure that they have enough money to live. They work with a sort of a very specific stakeholder group. But really, ultimately, their organization is about maximizing well-being, and they found that they were doing very well on the financial front. But one other thing that had happened for this stakeholder group was really to do with mental health. And they were doing a lot of stuff around the kind of financial health of their stakeholders, but they weren't really looking at all at the mental health. And as part of their kind of reimagining and their impact measurement process, they thought, right, there's this massive gap in the needs of the stakeholders. We've done this really well for 40, 50 years, but let's really try and reimagine and think about how we work with people. And as a result, they've been embarking on real kind of provision of proper mental health services for the people that they work with. So yeah, we would encourage you to be as kind of as creative as possible in this kind of process that you're going through. And then the sixth point that we're going to go through is really about partnership, which I think Dan touched on initially, kind of around the working collaboratively angle. And you'll see here on this slide that we've got this question that we're kind of presenting, which is working together working better? So we know that partnerships are often kind of talked about in a very I think it's probably a bit of a buzzword at the moment in the sector, but really before you embark on any partnerships, this initial question is something that you really need to consider up top. So is working together actually working better? And if the answer to that is yes, then that you may want to consider thinking about partnerships. Of course, partnerships come in a whole range, a whole spectrum, from a kind of loose sort of making sure that you're tuned in with other people in your local area or in the sector or service provision that you offer, making sure that you're keeping in touch with them on a regular basis so you know what their plans on, what their new strategy is, how your strategy might sort of fit in with theirs at a loose level, all the way up to more kind of legal, fundamental sort of mergers type conversations. But you know, partnership is really about making those links and drawing on those relationships. A couple of things about partnerships. The first is that this isn't necessarily a quick fix. You know, Mark was very good at mentioning that some of the points that we're talking about take a lot of time and some are more quick fixes. Partnerships, you can't rush into them. You need time to build up that social capital with people to, you know, trust is really, really important for many different types of partnerships. So if you think this is a journey that you want to embark on, then start early and don't rush it. Make sure that you are sort of building up that mutual connection with each other. And the other thing is you may want to think about partnerships outside of the sector as well. So corporates, public sector organisations, community groups, more informal community groups. There are lots of people out there who may be kind of interested in partnering with you. So again, the reimagining angle is a really sort of important one to come at when it comes to partnering. You're still on mute, Mark.
I was going to say it's 1-0. I was on mute. I'm so sorry. So just to re-emphasize that point that Helen's just made. I mean, when I was at Care International, we used to meet people, you know, from large corporates at the door, and we would say, would you like to give us some money? That's CSR. Please, here's the fundraising team. Or would you like to help us build a new business? And so with Barclays, with Unilever, with Procter & Gamble, and also with Starbucks, etc., we built new businesses. Yeah, but the amount of time it took for us to negotiate what our motivation was and what their motivation was and how we could align those, it was typically taking 2 to 3 years. Yeah, so to quickly go on this journey to actually create something where it's just a marketing message and there's this brand halo effect, that can be pretty quick. But to get a fundamental change in your organization, which really shifts to a new business, for example, yeah, takes time, takes effort, takes really difficult and in-depth conversations to move you on that journey. So I've just got 2 slides. We've talked at you for quite a long time, so I'm gonna open it up to quite a lot of questions. So next slide, please, Dan, if you may. I've popped in here this lovely report that we did back at Cass Business School in 2018. It was called Charities in a Dynamic World. And it gave lots and lots of questions that you can go and ask your board around collaboration, sustainability, efficiency, risk appetite, innovation, and use of reserves. So in other words, what we created was a list of good questions that you can take back to your board. And Dan and Helen, myself, hopefully have prompted some thinking here. Well, these questions will push you even further. Yeah. But as you recover or you choose to grow, stay focused. Yeah. I really believe in innovation. I really believe in trying new things, because then, you know, you become generative, you build for the future. But to do that, the second bullet point down, you've got to be able to sense and seize sense and seize the opportunities. So in other words, be mindful. If you're going to go and hunt for this, how do you become more mindful of the opportunities? How do you sense those opportunities? How do you then seize them? It's really interesting. Charities are really bad at sensing and seizing, whereas corporates are actually set up quite often to identify the opportunity and the market opportunity and to go for it. Yeah, it's a different way of thinking. Be more efficient, use your resources better, and let's face it, if you do have to close or there are fundamental problems, an orderly closeout is much better than a disorganized closeout. It's probably about 10 times cheaper for a start. And you may be able to pass on some of your reserves to another charity to go and carry on the good work that you do. So we've got then some questions on the next slide, and this is where we're opening now for a conversation with you guys. Yeah, so you've spent your time listening to us. We'd love to hear your views on this. Yeah, and as you go through and you start to think from 2021 and you start to get to 2022, you're going to ask fundamental questions like this. Yeah, how sustainable are you as an organization, really? Yeah, how much do you focus on impact? Don't give it a sop. Yeah, how much do you really understand what stakeholders, as Helen was saying, the positives and the negatives, and link into what they really need? Yeah. And then the final question, which I ran a session for at the Barclays, seminar stroke conference, was how efficient are you? And by the time I got through to the honest answer for that, there was an intake of breath in the room, because most charities said they were not efficient organizations. And it was stunning for me. Only, I think it was 15 or 20% said they were efficient organizations. So how efficient are you, honestly? Yeah. We would love to have some thoughts. I mean, do you want to pop into the chat function here, or the Q&A, or we can open up the, are we able to open up the line so that people can actually ask and we can engage in a conversation? Yeah, hopefully we can. We've got one Q&A question, which is awesome, and it's aimed at Helen, yeah? And it's really, really powerful. It says, in terms of impact measurement, where does the panel think we should draw a line on the sand re COVID? It's a great question. You know, delivering outcomes during the crisis and as opposed to now are separate from the new normal. What's your thoughts on that? Yeah. So, I mean, you know, how would you play that, Helen?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thanks for that, Carl. And I think the my answer would be that every organisation will probably have a different response to this. I'm involved with a sort of local community arts club here in Liverpool, and we've only just begun events again about 3 weeks ago. So our kind of development into the new normal is only really a very kind of early process, whereas I know a lot of organisations may have had a sort of initial adjustment crisis period to COVID, but may have sort of felt that they've been in this new normal state for a much, much longer time. So I think it's going to vary a lot for different organisations. I think the thing to my kind of main port of call when it comes to impact measurement is that transparency is the way forward. So whether it's kind of reporting back to your funders or reporting back to your own stakeholders or whatever, I would just go with being kind of quite straight up and transparent about where you are as an organisation. The other question on everyone's brains at the moment, I think, as it's getting colder and darker as we move into winter, is the question that Dan presented initially around this sort of fourth wave and things like that. So I think it's just worthwhile being very, very transparent and open with where you think you're at, and saying, you know, making the case that we don't know whether we're out of the woods yet. So we're reporting this. This is where we think we're at. This is the data that we've got. And we will do as best as we can over the coming months. And I think people will sort of understand that and take it as it's intended.
So I'm going to be provocative. I just want to get a conversation started here. I mean, back to the efficiency point. I mean, do you think you're efficient organizations? I've put yes or no or somewhat, even if you just want to pop yes or no into the chat function, just to give us some feedback, that would be great. And if anybody's brave enough to ask another question or to unmute themselves and say, a question to us, that would be fabulous. Yeah. Otherwise it becomes a little bit boring sat here. So questions, please.
Carla said yes.
Helen Sampson, no. Okay, wow. Okay, so thank you, Helen, for being really honest there. Are you able to say how you think you could improve your efficiency then? Please, if you want to take yourself off mute and...
I'm not sure if they can do that, Mark.
Oh, maybe they can't.
Maybe if you as a attendee know that you can do that, that would be great. But I'm not sure how that we've got the technology on our side to do that. Okay,
Marcus Phipps, somewhat efficient. We achieve a lot with what we have, but also have expensive internal process. Yeah, absolutely. So business process re-engineering can be really powerful to make you more efficient. Better use of technology, better use of, for example, workflows, which computer systems will give you, can help you to become much more efficient. Yeah. We achieve a lot with what we have. That's my learning from most of the charities I've ever worked with. Wow, we do a lot with very little. But sometimes, for example, using volunteers can be more expensive than actually having.
I think we've lost him.
Mark is in deepest, darkest Somerset, so there's occasionally tractor incidents outside his house, which results in
driving into pylons or things like that.
Yes, yeah, but I'm sure we can crack on whilst his internet kind of gets sorted.
So it's interesting, Helen Sampson saying that you're taking great interest in the impact idea. Hopefully that's come through from a lot of what we've been talking about, and particularly from the things that Helen Campbell's been saying. I don't know if you want to jump in and say a little bit more about the value of impact, Helen.
Yeah, so I think the real value of impact is really about truly understanding what it is that you actually do for people. So one of the kind of first things that we often do with clients when we start engaging with them is we have what we call a scoping session with the senior management team. We get everyone around the table and we would say, okay, what is it that you guys do? And there's often as many answers as there are people around the table, because we try and sort of preach about having a common mission and common aims and things like that. But actually, when it comes to what you do and the change that you affect, unless you've really been thinking about impact and having these conversations with stakeholders, it often ends up being more of a conversation around what we would call in the impact world a sort of output level. So we provide this service, we provide that service, we run this, we offer this. But actually, what we need to think about when we think about efficiency is the change that we're affecting in people's lives and how we're actually achieving that change. And that's the sort of the aim and the beauty of impact measurement, is it opens up that world to you, and you can have those sort of really good conversations with stakeholders to enlighten yourself on that level. So I definitely sort of encourage people to think about having that kind of conversation with stakeholders. And even if it's not a classic sort of formal focus group scenario, it might just be that you bump into a stakeholder somewhere in the building as you're walking around, and you could say on an informal basis, what sort of impact have we had on you? Could you talk to me a little bit about what changes you've experienced? Or, pre-COVID, we might have recommended doing a bit of a kind of social evening around Christmas, and sort of saying to staff before they go along and sort of mixing with stakeholders, asking them to try and have informal conversations with people in a sort of, as ethical a way as possible, obviously. So there's lots of opportunities to have these kind of conversations, and our experience is that once organizations start looking into the impact stuff, it really kind of starts kind of coming back to them sort of fourfold or fivefold in terms of the value that they kind of receive from that, and the intelligence that they have.
I see Helen Sampson's, but she has 350 volunteers that she works with, which will also represent a a treasure trove of individuals who are not only being impacted by your organization, they're stakeholders, the same as your beneficiaries, but they're also then being able to multiply that impact to countless others that they interact with, as well as the people that they live with, the people that they talk about their volunteering to. Yeah, that's a great resource. It's interesting, Brian Carlin said that you say, yes, you've become more efficient, with a very stark choice, become super efficient or face demise. And in some ways, that kind of choice was where we were going with the sigmoid curve that I talked about earlier, the Charles Handy idea that you're finding ways to grow, finding ways to do new things, or if you're not, then ultimately that graph starts to go downwards, and maybe it can go downwards quite steeply. And we don't want our charities to do that unless there's a good reason for their demise, that their work is done, or others can do their work better. So hopefully one of the themes that from Mark asking this question about how efficient are you is encouraging you all to think about efficiency in order to thrive in 2022, rather than face any opposite destinies. I don't know, Mark, whether you want to pick up on that.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, that's one way to shut me off. It shut me off. It's just
we told them about the regular tractor incidents that happens.
Living in the middle of Somerset, it happens. I just want you to take a conceptual step backwards here. Yeah, in a commercial organization, what happens is you get investment, you make a profit. As part of that profit is reinvested in the business to generate organic growth, and part of that is for distribution to shareholders. So what you've got is a model whereby you pump prime with investment, your growth and your future, investment to enable you to change and to grow. Whereas with a charity, and you're going to get a grant or you're going to get a contract, yeah, most charities who get a grant will only ever be able to put forward for the actual costs. Where does the innovation money come from? Where does the investment money come from? Where does the business development money come from? It's really hard. When you're putting forward for a contract, what we're seeing at the moment is a lot of these hybrid grant contracts called accountable grants, where you still have to be transparent about how much you're spending. But again, it gives you no opportunity. It's only when you've got a real contract and you're taking that risk, and you might have very small reserves, you're taking that risk as a charity, that you're able to make some money back for that by being really good at what you do and efficient, but charging a little bit of a profit. And many charities culturally just don't feel comfortable making a profit. Yeah. So we have. I mean, I love social enterprise as a model, because it gives you the ability to trade as a charity to make profit. I'm going to use that word profit. Yeah, you might want to use the word surplus, and to then have some money to do things for the future. But conceptually, the whole idea of charity not being able to make a profit, or not being able to claim more from grants, or not being able to actually make money from or build into contracts, the fact that they've got to actually innovate or change for the future, I just think it's wrong. I just want the charity sector to have more money and the ability to start to reimagine and innovate for the future. Otherwise, we're just going to go through the cycle of not being able to change. So conceptually, I hope you thought that was an interesting little diversion from me. People will disagree, but I mean, that's why then in a lot of the organizations we work with, when you've got a grant or you've got a contract, but then there's a gap that you have to go and fundraise for. Yeah. That's a very poor use of fundraising money to fill a gap that others wouldn't have paid. Anyway, this is a challenge for the foundation and trust to change their mindset. Absolutely, I totally agree. Any other quick questions or comments in the chat?
Carl has also put a question at the end of his last point there. Where does the panel feel small charities can focus limited resources? He's talked about some of the investments that he's made at Sorto GM over the last year.
I'm going to be very quick. Sharing finance, sharing fundraising with those that have got others that have a real skill base. And I think by sharing, you get somebody of a higher level quality. and are also able to do that at a good price for a smaller charity. Dan or Helen, any other ideas?
I think for me, the key is in trying to find those partnerships, because that's the way that you can kind of leverage those smaller resources. If you're able to really build stronger relationships with people who work with similar stakeholders, or who your stakeholders might kind of interact with and things like that, really trying to understand what they're doing and what you're doing is going to just be so important in terms of understanding what type of funding to access, what of your services are the most important ones, and so on and so forth. So for me, it would be about having those kind of partnership conversations.
And I guess I'd sort of repeat a phrase that Mark used sometimes: keep the main thing the main thing. When you are limited, there will always be lots of distractions. So you've used the word focus, Carl, in your question there, but focus is really important, and focusing on keeping doing the main thing that you do and doing it well.
So I'm not quite sure who's wrapping up. We planned all of this beautifully, and then we didn't work out who was actually wrapping up. So I think we've come to the end of our hour. I just want to thank everybody as ever for joining us. Please come and talk to us if you have any questions. We're always available to have a conversation. And go and be brilliant as the organizations that I know you are. Dan, Helen, anything I've forgotten, or any closing
just a reminder,
thoughts?
if you'd like to take these conversations further, we're doing a session, as Helen said, on the 21st of October, a half day, probably a morning on this, just an opportunity for charity leaders to sit and talk, and we'll explore some of these themes in much greater depth. And those who've been to our training sessions in the past have generally, have all walked away happy with what they've received and been able to apply it in their organizations. So take a look at that when the email comes around. Thank you everyone for your comments. That's nice.
Yes, yeah. Thank you very much.
With that, it's a wrap. So Marcus
It's a wrap.
Helen Sampson, thank you very much indeed.